What if a simple flight home turned into a national controversy? When travel blogger Nia Holloway booked a first-class ticket, she never expected to be questioned, over and over, about whether she belonged there. But one moment of discrimination sparked a movement that no one saw coming. A viral post, a corporate scandal, and a televised showdown that had the whole country watching. Now the question is, will her fight change the system, or will history repeat itself? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning air in New York carried the crispness of early spring, the kind that teased of warmer days ahead, but still clung to the last traces of winter. Nia Holloway adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag as she stepped out of her apartment building, pulling her light gray sweater closer around her shoulders. The city was already alive with honking cabs and hurried footsteps, but she moved at her own pace, a rare thing for someone always on the go. Today was different. For once, she wasn't traveling for work. No five-star hotels to review, no luxury lounges to critique, no carefully curated itinerary to follow. Just a flight back home, back to Atlanta, where her mother would be waiting with a warm meal and a dozen questions about why she didn't visit more often. She sighed, half smiling to herself as she slid into the back seat of a waiting rideshare. "The airport, please," she told the driver, glancing at her phone to check her flight details. First class, paid in full. It was a simple fact, yet it always came with an edge. She'd long stopped expecting the smooth, seamless experience that was supposed to come with a first-class ticket. It was never just a matter of boarding a plane and settling in. There were always the second glances, the quick up and down assessments, the subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, hesitation before her ticket was accepted as legitimate. The car weaved through Manhattan traffic, the familiar rhythm of the city passing by in streaks of yellow cabs and blurred storefronts. Nia rested her head against the window, letting her thoughts drift. She should have been looking forward to this trip. After all, it wasn't often she let herself take a break, but there was always that nagging tension, that tiny weight pressing against the back of her mind. Would this flight be different? By the time she arrived at JFK, the airport was buzzing with travelers. Business professionals with sleek carry-ons, families juggling strollers and restless children, couples whispering travel plans over cups of overpriced coffee. The polished floors reflected the artificial glow of the overhead lights, making the whole place feel both grand and impersonal at the same time. She made her way to the first-class check-in counter, pulling out her ID and digital boarding pass. The agent behind the desk, a young woman with a tight ponytail and a well-practiced smile, barely glanced at her before taking the documents. Nia waited, watching as the agent's fingers hovered over the keyboard. A small crease formed between her brows. She looked at the screen, then at Nia, then back at the screen again. "Give me just a moment," the agent said, her tone pleasant but distant. Nia knew this script. The pause, the quick scan for a supervisor, the internal debate of whether or not to ask her to step aside while they double-check. She glanced at the line beside her, where a woman, blonde, mid-40s, draped in an expensive coat, had just walked up. The agent at that counter smiled, took her ticket, tapped a few keys, and within seconds handed it back. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins. You're all set. Enjoy your flight." Nia exhaled slowly. The agent in front of her finally pressed something on the screen and handed her back her documents. "You're good to go, Ms. Holloway." No apology, no acknowledgement of the extra scrutiny. Just a quick nod before moving on to the next passenger. She slid her ID into her wallet and turned toward security, her grip tightening on the handle of her bag. The feeling sat heavy in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite surprise. Just that familiar, exhausting sense of déjà vu. She kept walking, merging into the steady stream of passengers heading toward their gates, blending into the crowd. Her mother's voice played in her mind, warm and teasing. "Baby, you work too much. When was the last time you came home just to relax?" She'd tell her soon. She'd be home soon. The first-class lounge at JFK had a stillness to it, the kind of quiet that only money could buy. Plush leather chairs were spaced out generously, giving each traveler their own bubble of privacy. The faint clinking of ice in crystal glasses mixed with the muted hum of business calls and fingers tapping against laptop keyboards. Nia settled into a seat near the corner, adjusting her hoodie so it covered most of her face. She didn't want to attract attention, not here, not in a space where she already felt like an anomaly. She scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly, flipping past emails and news articles, but her mind kept circling back to the check-in counter, to that brief hesitation, that unnecessary scrutiny. It had been so subtle, yet so familiar. She shook the thought away, willing herself to focus on something else. This was supposed to be a break, a rare moment where she wasn't working, wasn't analyzing every detail for a review. She was just another traveler, heading home. Across the room, a flight attendant adjusted her uniform in the reflection of a glass panel. Cassidy Brenner stood tall, her blonde hair neatly pinned back, her navy blue uniform pressed to perfection. Every move she made was precise, practiced, an image she had worked hard to perfect. She prided herself on professionalism, on making sure first-class passengers received the highest level of service, and on making sure the wrong kind of passenger didn't disrupt that experience. Her gaze swept over the lounge, landing on Nia. Something didn't fit. Cassidy had worked enough flights to recognize the usual clientele of first class, the frequent flyers, the executives, the well-dressed socialites. And then there was this woman, dressed in casual clothes, tucked into the corner like she didn't belong. She let out a quiet breath, smoothing her uniform. It wasn't her place to judge, but it was her job to maintain order. Boarding began. Nia pulled her bag over her shoulder and made her way to the gate, blending into the line of first-class passengers. She handed over her ticket, receiving a polite nod from the agent this time. No hesitation, no questions. As she stepped onto the plane, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The first-class cabin exuded exclusivity, wide, cushioned seats, soft ambient lighting, the scent of fresh linen and citrus-scented air freshener. Flight attendants moved with precision, offering welcome drinks and adjusting pillows. Nia exhaled slowly, reminding herself that she had every right to be here. She found her seat, 3A, beside a window, and placed her bag in the overhead compartment. Then, before she could sit, a figure stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right cabin?" The words weren't rude, but the tone was unmistakable. Nia turned, locking eyes with the flight attendant. Cassidy Brenner. Nia didn't flinch. She'd heard this before. She knew what came next. Silently, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up without a word. Cassidy took the ticket, her eyes scanning it for longer than necessary. Something about the way this woman looked at her, the doubt in her gaze, lit a slow-burning fire in Nia's chest. Cassidy frowned, glancing back at the seat, then at Nia. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment while I double-check?" Her voice was polite, practiced, but Nia caught the hesitation, the unnecessary second-guessing. A few passengers nearby glanced over. A man in a tailored suit lowered his newspaper slightly, his brow furrowing. A woman across the aisle peeked up from her phone. Nia didn't move. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her tone calm, measured. Cassidy hesitated, as if debating whether to push further. Then, with a small sigh, she handed back the ticket. But her stance didn't soften. "There must have been a mistake with your booking." "Let's get this sorted out," Cassidy said, gesturing toward the galley. A flicker of something cold settled in Nia's chest. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down, familiar yet infuriating. Before she could respond, a voice spoke from a few rows ahead. An older man, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his expression, an awareness. Robert L. Carter. He had seen it. All of it. For a second, it looked like he might say something. His lips parted slightly, but then he hesitated. And in that moment, Cassidy made her decision. "This way, ma'am," she said, firmer this time. Nia inhaled sharply but didn't argue. Not yet. She picked up her bag, stepping out of the aisle. She felt the stares, the unspoken assumptions. But she knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The plane roared as it lifted off the runway, the vibrations rumbling beneath Nia's seat. She kept her gaze fixed outside the window, watching the skyline shrink below her. The city she had called home for years faded into a patchwork of lights and shadows, swallowed by the clouds. She let out a slow breath, willing herself to relax, but the tension sat heavy in her chest, refusing to loosen its grip. The hum of the engines did little to drown out the frustration simmering beneath her skin. No matter how much she achieved, how much she proved herself, there was always a moment like this, an unnecessary challenge, a reminder that she would always have to validate her presence in spaces where she was meant to belong. She unclenched her hands, realizing only then how tightly she had been gripping the armrest. Around her, passengers settled in, adjusting their seats, flipping through in-flight magazines. No one seemed to notice her, or if they did, they didn't care enough to make it obvious. That was the thing about flying. People stayed in their own bubbles, wrapped in their own little worlds. But from across the cabin, someone was watching. Robert L. Carter sat upright in his first-class seat, hands resting lightly on the foldable tray before him. He was old enough to have seen versions of this play out before. The doubt, the quiet resistance, the unspoken question of whether to speak up or let things slide. He had been in enough courtrooms to recognize injustice, but this wasn't a courtroom. And after decades of fighting, of pushing back against systems that never seemed to bend, he had learned to choose his battles. Still, something about the way the flight attendant had looked at the young woman, at Nia, stirred something in him. The same old weight pressing against his chest, the one he had carried for years. He adjusted his tie, looking away. Nia didn't notice him. She was too busy trying to swallow the knot in her throat, to push aside the lingering anger gnawing at her, but her thoughts refused to settle. Then she saw her. Cassidy Brenner walked down the aisle, her posture sharp, controlled. The contrast was striking. Just moments ago in first class, her demeanor had been rigid, guarded. Here in economy, she moved with ease, flashing polite smiles as she passed passengers, checking on their needs. It was subtle, but Nia saw it. The way Cassidy's body language softened, how her voice carried warmth when she spoke to others. But when Cassidy's gaze flickered toward her, that ease was gone. For a moment, their eyes met, and Cassidy hesitated, just briefly. But it was enough. Then without a word, she turned away and continued down the aisle. Nia let out a slow breath through her nose. She wasn't imagining it. A few minutes passed before another flight attendant appeared, one Nia hadn't seen before. A younger woman, her expression carefully neutral. She hesitated beside Nia's seat before leaning down slightly, lowering her voice. "I apologize for any confusion earlier. Would you like a complimentary drink?" Nia blinked, processing the words. There it was, the quiet attempt at smoothing things over. She could read between the lines. This wasn't an apology, it was a peace offering, a way to acknowledge what had happened without really acknowledging it. Nia held the woman's gaze, letting the silence stretch between them. Then finally she shook her head. "No, thank you." The attendant straightened, gave a small nod, and walked away. Nia exhaled, her fingers tightening around the phone in her lap. They thought this would be enough. A simple gesture, a free drink, and everything would go back to normal. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. She unlocked her phone and opened a blank note. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second. Then she started to type. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, a constant background noise that filled the cabin. The initial bustle of passengers getting comfortable had died down. Overhead lights dimmed, and the soft glow of reading lamps flickered across rows of seats. Conversations had quieted into murmurs, and the clinking of ice in plastic cups from the beverage cart was the only real sign of movement. Nia sat still, her fingers hovering over her phone screen. She had started typing, then stopped, started again, deleted a line. The words felt heavy, even though she had written about experiences like this before. But this wasn't just another entry about bad customer service or a poorly handled flight. This was personal, and it wasn't just about her. She took a breath, steadied her thoughts, and let her fingers move. A few rows ahead, Cassidy Brenner moved swiftly through the first-class section, but her eyes kept flicking toward the economy cabin, toward Nia. Something about the way she was glued to her phone unsettled Cassidy. She had seen it before, passengers filing complaints, posting angry reviews. But this felt different. She leaned in toward another flight attendant, her voice a quiet hiss. I don't know why she's making such a big deal about this. The other woman, a junior crew member, glanced toward the back of the plane, then back at Cassidy. I mean, Cassidy continued, keeping her voice low, we checked her ticket. She got a seat, didn't she? The junior attendant hesitated. Still, maybe it could have been handled differently? Cassidy huffed, crossing her arms. I did everything by the book. The junior attendant didn't argue, just gave a non-committal nod and moved on. But Cassidy's fingers twitched against the hem of her uniform, a nervous habit she barely noticed. She hated feeling like she wasn't in control of a situation, and right now, something was off. Further back in the first-class section, Robert L. Carter tapped his fingers against the armrest of his seat. He had been sitting with his thoughts for too long now, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing against his conscience. For years, he had told himself he was done fighting battles. He had spent a lifetime in courtrooms, advocating, arguing, pushing for change. He had seen progress, sure, but also too many moments like this one, where nothing changed because no one spoke up. He exhaled sharply, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood. The shift in the cabin was subtle. People barely noticed as he made his way down the aisle. But Cassidy did. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched him. Nia, still deep in thought, barely registered his presence until he slid into the empty seat beside her. I saw what happened, he said, his voice low but firm. That wasn't right. She looked up, caught off guard. Robert wasn't just some passenger passing through. There was something in his gaze, an understanding, an awareness that made her sit up a little straighter. Nia studied him for a moment before speaking. You saw it, but you didn't say anything. Robert didn't flinch. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice even. I used to be a civil rights attorney. I've seen situations like this more times than I can count, and I've fought against them. But I also know that sometimes people have to choose whether to fight their own battles. Nia let out a breath, tilting her head slightly. And you think this is one of those times? Robert gave a small, thoughtful nod. I do, but the question is, do you? Her fingers tightened around her phone. She had already made her decision before he sat down. She turned the screen slightly toward him, letting him read the words she had just typed. They think they can get away with this. Let's see if they still think that tomorrow. Robert exhaled, a knowing look in his eyes. You're not wrong, he murmured. The plane soared on through the sky, unaware of what was about to unfold. But Cassidy could feel it. She didn't know how, but something had shifted. The airplane glided steadily through the sky, the seatbelt sign long since turned off. A few passengers dozed off under the dim cabin lights, while others scrolled through their phones or flipped lazily through in-flight magazines. The hum of the engines had settled into a low, constant vibration, a background noise that should have been calming. But Nia wasn't calm. She sat with her phone in hand, her thumb hovering over the post button. The words on the screen were sharp, deliberate. They weren't just about her. They were about every moment she'd felt this before. Every glance, every pause, every unnecessary question. She had spent years brushing it off, letting it roll off her shoulders like it didn't matter. But today, she wasn't in the mood to let it go. She pressed the button. Almost instantly, notifications started to roll in. At first, it was just a few likes and comments, her usual followers responding. But within minutes, it was clear this wasn't just another post. The engagement was climbing rapidly. People were sharing their own stories in the comments. Others were tagging airlines, calling them out for similar treatment. Nia leaned back against her seat, exhaling slowly. Across the cabin, Cassidy Brenner walked toward the front of the plane, her polished shoes clicking against the carpeted floor. She was about to turn into the galley when a fellow flight attendant leaned toward her, whispering something. Cassidy frowned. What do you mean people are staring at me? She muttered. The attendant hesitated. I think something's going on. A couple of passengers in first class were talking about a post. Something about discrimination? Cassidy's stomach tightened. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She wasn't supposed to check it mid-flight, but the nagging feeling in her gut told her this wasn't just a routine complaint. Her heart sank the moment she saw it. Nia Holloway, a verified account. Thousands of shares in under an hour. Her name wasn't in the post, but it didn't need to be. The story was clear. The description was too specific. And the comments. God, the comments. People were furious. Some were calling for boycotts. Others were sharing their own stories about experiences with flight attendants who had made them feel unwelcome in first class. Cassidy's fingers tightened around the phone. She could already picture what would happen when they landed. The emails, the corporate meetings, the possibility that her supervisors would see her as a liability instead of a dedicated employee. Her pulse quickened. She had worked too hard for this. For a split second, she considered ignoring it. Maybe if she stayed professional, acted like nothing had happened, it would blow over. People moved on quickly. But what if they didn't? Her jaw tightened. She wasn't about to let some influencer control the narrative. Squaring her shoulders, she turned on her heel and strode toward the economy cabin. Passengers glanced up as she passed, sensing the tension in her steps. But Nia didn't look up. She was sipping from a plastic cup of water, scrolling through her phone as if she hadn't just set off a social media storm. Cassidy cleared her throat. "Ms. Holloway," she said, her voice carefully measured, "I'd like to clarify any misunderstandings about earlier." Nia took another sip of water, then set her cup down. She didn't react immediately, just let the silence hang in the air for a beat too long. Then finally she glanced up, her expression unreadable. "I think you made yourself pretty clear back there." Cassidy inhaled sharply. She had expected Nia to be upset, but the calmness, the quiet defiance, made her uneasy. She straightened her posture. "We have certain protocols we follow to ensure a smooth experience for our first-class passengers." Nia raised an eyebrow. "And one of those protocols is assuming a black woman can't afford a first-class ticket?" Cassidy's lips parted, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of eyes on her now. Other passengers, those who had been pretending not to listen, were watching closely. Even some from first class had leaned forward, curious. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then from a few seats away, a voice cut through it. "Miss," Robert L. Carter said, his voice calm but firm, "I think you've said enough." Cassidy's breath hitched. She looked toward him, realizing that he had been paying attention all along. There was something knowing in his gaze, something steady in the way he held himself. Her fingers curled slightly, her nails pressing into her palm. She forced herself to nod, turning on her heel. She walked away back toward first class, but she could feel the shift in the cabin behind her, the change in energy. Cassidy felt something she hadn't expected. Fear. The moment the wheels touched the ground at Hartsfield-Jackson, a murmur of relief rippled through the cabin. The usual sounds of a flight coming to an end, the chime of seatbelts unfastening, the rustling of bags being retrieved from under seats, filled the space. But for Nia, the landing didn't bring relief. If anything, it felt like the real turbulence was only just beginning. She reached for her phone, its screen lighting up with an endless flood of notifications. The numbers were staggering. Her post had gone viral. She scrolled through the sheer volume of responses. Hundreds of thousands of likes, shares, and comments. Strangers recounting their own experiences, others expressing outrage, tagging major airlines, demanding answers. Some were sharing her words with captions like, "This has to stop." Her stomach twisted as she read through them. This wasn't just another travel story. It had struck a nerve. She barely noticed as the line of passengers began shuffling forward, eager to get off the plane. Only when the aisle started clearing did she finally grab her bag and stand. As she moved toward the exit, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Some were filled with quiet support, others with curiosity. And then there were those who glanced at her the way people look at the subject of a breaking news story, like she was no longer just a passenger, but something bigger than herself. When she stepped out into the jet bridge, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Beyond the glass doors leading to the terminal, a small cluster of people had gathered near the arrival gate. Cameras in hand, press badges clipped to their collars. Reporters. She felt her heart quicken. How had this escalated so fast? Before she could process it, a man in a navy blue suit approached her with purposeful strides. His polished shoes clicked against the tile floor as he stopped just short of invading her space. "Ms. Holloway?" His voice was smooth, professional. "I'm with..." He rattled off the name of the airline. "I'd like to have a quick word before you leave." Nia glanced at him, taking in the carefully neutral expression. She already knew what this was. He lowered his voice. We'd prefer to handle this matter internally before it becomes something larger. Too late for that, he continued, offering a diplomatic smile. We'd like to formally apologize for any misunderstanding. Of course, we take concerns like yours very seriously. We'd be happy to discuss compensation for your experience. Nia inhaled sharply, keeping her expression steady. A private apology, a discreet payout, a carefully worded statement. That was the playbook. They wanted this handled behind closed doors, swept under the rug before it could cause real damage. She shook her head. No. The man blinked, clearly not expecting an outright refusal. I'm sorry? I'm not interested, she said, her voice firm. I didn't come here to negotiate. She stepped around him without another word. As she walked, she caught sight of Robert L. Carter standing a few feet ahead, watching the exchange with quiet amusement. You handled that well, he said as she reached him. She let out a breath, still feeling the weight of the moment. They thought they could buy my silence. Robert nodded knowingly. They always do. There was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. He adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag. If you decide you want to push this further, you have options. Nia turned to face him fully. I spent my career fighting cases like this, he said. If you want legal support, I'll help you find the right people. She studied him for a moment, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and apprehension. This was already spinning out of control. Did she really want to escalate it even more? But then she thought about every comment she had read on her post, every person who had shared their own version of what happened to her. This wasn't just about her anymore. She met his gaze. I'll think about it. Meanwhile, just a few feet away, Cassidy Brenner stepped off the plane. She barely had a chance to take in the terminal before a voice called her name. Cassidy! She turned to see one of her supervisors waiting for her, arms crossed. The expression on his face made her stomach drop. Her heart pounded as she followed him away from the gate, toward a quieter corridor. We need to talk, he said flatly. Cassidy swallowed hard. The fear that had been creeping at the edges of her mind settled into something real. She had thought she was in control. She wasn't anymore. The airport was alive with movement. The steady murmur of conversations, the rhythmic clatter of luggage wheels on polished floors, the occasional overhead announcement calling passengers to their gates. But for Nia, it all faded into the background the moment she stepped into the baggage claim area. The cameras were waiting. A cluster of reporters stood near the exit, their lenses trained in her direction. Some held microphones. Others had their phones raised, ready to capture her every move. A few passers-by had stopped as well, whispering among themselves as they recognized her face from the viral post. She barely had time to react before the first question hit her. Nia, do you have a statement about the airline's response? Another voice cut in. Do you plan to take legal action? A third followed almost immediately. Do you think this will create real change in the airline industry? Nia exhaled sharply, gripping the strap of her bag. She hadn't expected this. The online reaction, sure. But this? Reporters waiting for her the second she landed? Her fingers twitched toward her phone, instinctively searching for an escape. Then it vibrated. A call. She glanced at the screen. Mom. She hesitated for only a second before answering. Baby, her mother's voice came through, thick with concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, Mom. She forced her voice to stay steady. I saw the news, her mother continued, the worry evident. It's everywhere. Are you sure this is a fight you want to take on? Nia swallowed. She had spent years navigating these moments, deciding which battles were worth the energy, which ones she could let go of. She had told herself this was just another flight, just another frustration. But it wasn't. Not anymore. I don't know yet, she admitted, eyes still locked on the reporters ahead. But I think I need to find out. Her mother sighed. Just be careful, okay? I don't want you getting caught up in something that... I know, Nia softened. I promise. She hung up, gripping her phone tightly. At that moment, another notification popped up. A direct message request. National news anchor Julia Parsons would like to invite you for an exclusive live interview on tonight's primetime segment. Nia stared at the words. A national broadcast. A chance to speak directly to millions. Her heart pounded. She had never wanted to be the center of a movement. She was a storyteller, a writer, someone who captured moments rather than becoming one. But now the moment was staring back at her, waiting for her to make a choice. Would she take it? Across the airport, in a stark conference room behind closed doors, Cassidy Brenner sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. The executives sat across from her, their expressions unreadable. The room smelled of stale coffee and the faint scent of anxiety. "We've received an overwhelming amount of negative press," one of them started. "Passengers are canceling flights. We're trending for all the wrong reasons." Cassidy forced herself to stay composed. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was following protocol." Another executive, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Protocol doesn't explain the footage we reviewed." Cassidy's breath caught. Footage. Her mind raced. They had cameras in first class, of course, but surely... A third executive slid a tablet across the table. The video was paused on an image of herself, standing in the aisle, blocking Nia's path. The doubt in her posture, the suspicion in her face, it was all there. And then they pressed play. The hesitation before scanning the ticket, the second unnecessary check, the way her lips tightened as she spoke to Nia, the way her body language shifted when dealing with other passengers. She felt her stomach twist. This was different from reading a post, different from seeing people comment online. Here in this quiet room, she had to face herself. "This doesn't look good, Cassidy," the first executive said, voice even. "And the way things are going, we need to make decisions quickly." Her mouth was dry. "Decisions? We're considering suspension," the woman replied, "effective immediately." Cassidy's pulse pounded in her ears. Suspension. That was just a step away from termination. She had worked for years to climb the ranks, to be seen as the best in her field. Now one moment, one passenger, was unraveling everything. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist they were overreacting. But as she looked at their faces, she realized something chilling. They weren't just trying to contain the damage. They were looking for someone to blame, and she was the easiest target. Back in the baggage claim area, Nia took a slow, deliberate step forward. The reporters straightened, readying themselves. Her phone vibrated again. More messages, more news outlets reaching out. She glanced at the screen. She could stay quiet. Let the moment pass. Go home. Pretend none of this happened. Or, she lifted her gaze, her decision settling into place. This wasn't just her fight anymore. Nia sat at the kitchen table, the scent of freshly brewed tea drifting in the air. The soft hum of a ceiling fan filled the silence as she scrolled through her phone. Her inbox flooded with messages. Some were from news outlets requesting interviews. Others were from people sharing their own experiences, their voices blending into a collective frustration that had been simmering for years. Across from her, Diane Holloway folded her arms, watching her daughter carefully. "The world doesn't change overnight, sweetheart," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Are you ready for this fight?" Nia exhaled slowly, setting her phone down. She had heard that tone from her mother before, the mixture of concern and wisdom, the kind that came from years of experience. "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't expect any of this." Diane sighed, shaking her head. "You might not have expected it, but here it is. And once something like this starts, you don't get to just walk away." Nia looked down at her hands. That was the problem, wasn't it? She had choices, but none of them were easy. She could stay quiet, let the story fade, move on. Or she could step into it, own it. But that meant risk, not just for her, but for her career, her reputation, her peace. "You've worked so hard to build something for yourself, Nia," her mother continued, her voice softer now. "Are you willing to put all of that on the line?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, eyes flickering toward the window, where the Georgia sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. Her mother wasn't wrong. But what did it say about her if she just let this pass? A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Diane wiped her hands on a dish towel and made her way to answer it. A moment later, she stepped aside, letting Robert L. Carter into the room. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, offering Diane a polite nod before turning his attention to Nia. "Not at all," Diane replied. "I'll leave you two to talk." Nia straightened as Robert took the seat across from her, his movements slow and deliberate. There was an air of patience about him, as if he wasn't in a rush to force a decision out of her. "I assume you've been thinking a lot," he said, resting his hands on the table. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "That's an understatement." Robert studied her for a moment. "I know what it's like to be at this kind of crossroads. When I was younger, I had to decide whether to take a case that would put me in the spotlight, whether to put my name behind something that wasn't just about me." Nia met his gaze. "What did you do?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I took it, and it changed everything." She swallowed, letting his words settle. "You don't have to do this," Robert continued, his tone measured. "No one would blame you for stepping back. But if you don't fight this, who will?" Nia looked down at her phone again. The notifications hadn't stopped. People were still talking, still sharing. The weight of it pressed against her chest. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She picked up her phone, staring at the name of the producer from the national news station. She took a breath, then pressed call. A voice answered almost immediately. "I'll do it," she said, steady now. "I'll go on air." Robert nodded approvingly while Diane, still standing in the doorway, let out a quiet sigh. There was no turning back now. The air in the television studio felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was just Nia's nerves, or maybe it was the way everything, the walls, the makeup chair, the quiet buzz of last-minute preparations, felt sterile and impersonal. The glow of the vanity mirror reflected her own face back at her, and she looked like someone about to step into a battle she wasn't sure she was ready for. A makeup artist dabbed at her forehead with a sponge, brushing away the last traces of shine. "Almost done," the woman said, her voice kind but distant, as if she knew Nia's mind was elsewhere. Her phone vibrated in her lap. Another message from her mother. "Be careful with your words, sweetheart. They'll twist whatever they can." She swallowed hard. This wasn't like writing a blog post. It wasn't like sitting behind a screen and letting her words carry themselves into the world. This was live television. This was national. What if she said the wrong thing? What if she made things worse? A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Holloway, we're ready for you." She turned to see a studio assistant standing in the doorway, his headset resting around his neck. She took a breath, smoothing her sweater before standing. Her legs felt heavier than they should have as she followed him through the hallway, past cables and camera operators, past people who barely spared her a glance. And then suddenly, she was there. The stage was sleek and modern, a round table positioned under soft blue lights. The host, Julia Parsons, a woman known for her sharp interviews and unflinching demeanor, sat waiting with a practiced smile. Nia took her seat, the cameras adjusting, the crew making final checks. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. "Good evening, America," Julia began, her voice smooth and measured. "Tonight we sit down with Nia Holloway, the travel blogger whose recent post about discrimination in first class has sparked a nationwide conversation." Nia's fingers curled slightly in her lap. Julia turned to face her. "Nia, let's start here. Some say the flight attendant was simply doing her job, following protocol. Do you feel that you may have overreacted?" The question was expected, but it still stung. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I don't think I overreacted," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "I reacted because this isn't the first time something like this has happened. And if we don't talk about it, it won't be the last." A hush settled over the room, the weight of her words stretching between them. Julia nodded slightly, her eyes assessing. "There are people who support you, but there are also those who believe this is about seeking attention rather than real change. What do you say to that?" Nia resisted the urge to scoff. "I say that people who've never experienced this will always find a way to dismiss it," she said, "because acknowledging it means accepting that it happens. And that's a lot harder than pretending it doesn't." A shift rippled through the audience. The conversation continued, Julia pressing, Nia standing her ground. With each question, her confidence grew. And then, in the middle of it all, something happened. One of the producers, standing near the monitors, suddenly put a hand to his earpiece. His expression changed. He stepped forward, whispering something to Julia while the cameras were still rolling. She blinked in surprise but quickly regained composure. We're receiving breaking news, Julia said, turning back to Nia. A video has just been leaked from the airline's internal security footage. A screen behind them flickered to life. The grainy black and white footage showed the moment Nia had tried to take her seat. Cassidy Brenner stood in front of her, scanning the ticket, then scanning it again and again. Even as other passengers passed through without a second glance, the clip was damning. It left no room for debate. The audience gasped. The tension in the studio thickened. Nia's breath caught. Julia turned back to her, the sharpness in her eyes replaced with something else. It appears the airline may have more explaining to do. Online, the reaction was immediate. The hashtag #JusticePhonia started trending. And Cassidy Brenner? Her name was about to become one that the entire country knew. The boardroom was silent except for the low hum of the projector. The screen at the front of the room displayed the grainy black and white footage. Again. None of the executives said a word as they watched Cassidy Brenner block Nia's path, scan her ticket multiple times, and hesitate before finally allowing her to pass. Someone cleared their throat. The CEO of the airline, a tall man with silvering hair, leaned back in his chair. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept since the story broke. Maybe he hadn't. "This is bad," he finally muttered. A younger executive, sleeves rolled up, rubbed his temple. "It's worse than bad. We're hemorrhaging customers. People are canceling flights, calling for boycotts." Another voice chimed in. "Our social media team can't keep up with the backlash. Every time we try to put out a statement, it gets drowned out by more customer complaints. People are sharing their own experiences. This isn't just about Holloway anymore." The room tensed at those words, because that was the real problem. If this had been just one viral post, they might have been able to contain it. But now, it was something bigger. "We need to make a move," the CEO said, tapping his fingers against the polished mahogany table. "A public statement, an internal investigation." "And Brenner?" someone asked. The room went quiet. The CEO exhaled sharply. "She's suspended, effective immediately." No one objected. They all knew it had to be done. But even as the decision was made, the unease in the room didn't lift, because they weren't in control of the narrative. Cassidy sat in her car, parked outside her apartment, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Suspended. The word echoed in her mind, over and over, as she stared at her phone. The news was everywhere now. She was being called out by name. People were digging through her social media, dissecting everything she had ever said online. She scrolled through the comments. Some defended her, but most didn't. She pressed a contact in her phone. A lawyer. The line rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She tried another. Same result. No one wanted to be associated with this. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't fair. She had only done what she thought was right. Hadn't she? Across the city, Nia sat on the couch in her childhood home, her legs tucked beneath her. She had barely had a moment to breathe since the interview aired. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing, the flood of messages never ending. Some were from people thanking her, sharing their own experiences. Others were less supportive. But the most unexpected call came just minutes ago, a civil rights organization. They wanted to talk. She stared at the number on her screen, debating whether to call back. This was never the plan. She hadn't intended to become the face of a movement. She had simply written a post about what happened to her. That was it. But it wasn't just about her anymore. Her mother sat beside her, watching. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Nia ran a hand over her face. "I know, but you're thinking about it." She let out a breath. "Yeah." Her mother reached for her hand, giving it a squeeze. "Then whatever you choose, make sure it's your choice." Nia nodded, staring down at her phone. This was bigger than she had ever imagined, and she wasn't sure she was ready. But maybe it wasn't about being ready. Maybe it was about stepping up anyway. She took a deep breath, then pressed the call button. The house smelled like home. Warm spices from her mother's kitchen, the lingering scent of old books in the living room, and the faint traces of lavender from the fabric softener Diane had always used. It was the kind of comfort Nia had been craving ever since she stepped off that plane. But now, as she sat at the dining table, phone in hand, that comfort felt distant. She scrolled through her notifications. the sheer volume overwhelming. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. Headlines ranged from neutral to outright sensational. Nia Holloway sparks national conversation on airline discrimination. Should airlines rethink their policies? Activist or attention seeker? America debates viral airline incident. She set the phone down, exhaling. Her mother, Diane, watched her carefully from across the table. "I knew you'd stir things up one day," she said, her voice light but tinged with worry. Nia let out a tired laugh. "This isn't exactly what I had in mind." Diane reached for the teapot, pouring steaming chamomile into a mug before sliding it toward her daughter. "I just wanted to visit," Nia muttered. "See you. Spend time at home. Now the whole country's watching." Diane wrapped her fingers around her own cup. "They're watching because you said something they've been waiting to hear." Nia rubbed her temples. "But what if I'm not the right person to lead this? I'm not an activist. I write about travel. I don't organize protests or draft policy changes." Diane's gaze softened. "Baby, do you think the people who changed the world were always ready for it?" Before Nia could respond, the doorbell rang. She didn't have to ask who it was. Robert L. Carter stood on the porch, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, the chill of the evening settling in around him. Diane opened the door, stepping aside to let him in. Robert nodded in greeting. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Diane said, though her eyes flickered toward Nia with quiet understanding. Robert sat across from her, his expression calm but unreadable. "How are you holding up?" Nia let out a breath. "I don't know." Robert leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "Nia, this isn't just about you anymore. This is about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. You've started something. The question is, are you going to see it through?" She looked away. "I never wanted to be in this position," she admitted. He nodded. "I believe that." Silence settled between them for a long moment. Then Robert reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded letter. "This came from the Civil Rights Legal Advocacy Group. They want you to be the face of a campaign pushing for anti-discrimination policies in the airline industry." Nia's stomach tightened. "They want me to be their spokesperson?" "They want you to help lead a movement," Robert corrected. "A real, tangible push for change. Not just talk." Diane, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "That's a lot to put on her shoulders." Robert didn't argue. "It is, and only she can decide if it's worth it." Nia took the letter, running her fingers over the crease. This was the moment, the fork in the road. She could walk away, let the news cycle move on, return to the life she had built for herself. Or she could step forward, knowing it would change everything. Diane reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I'm scared for you, Nia," she said softly, "but I'm proud of you." Nia swallowed the lump in her throat, then slowly she picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she started typing. A single sentence, "This isn't over." She hit post. Within seconds, notifications flooded in, and within an hour, the headlines had already changed. Nia Holloway to lead fight for fair airline policies. The decision had been made. The press conference was supposed to be damage control. The airline executives sat behind a sleek, polished table, microphones lined up in front of them. Camera flashes flickered across their faces as journalists filled the room, waiting for answers. The CEO, a man who had spent decades maneuvering through corporate crises, adjusted his tie and leaned forward. "We take this matter seriously," he said, his voice measured. "As a company, we are committed to ensuring that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect. Moving forward, we will implement new sensitivity training to prevent incidents like this from happening again." His words echoed through the room, but the silence that followed was deafening. No one was buying it. The reporters didn't even wait for the PR team to signal before firing off questions. "Will Cassidy Brenner be reinstated? Is the company taking responsibility for the culture that allowed this to happen? Why should the public believe this isn't just another empty corporate apology?" The CEO's smile tightened. He had rehearsed his responses, but the energy in the room was slipping out of his control. Because the public didn't want another vague promise. They wanted accountability. And that was something the airline wasn't prepared to give. Cassidy Brenner wasn't going to let them make her the villain. Sitting in front of the bright lights of a conservative talk show studio, she smoothed her skirt and took a steady breath. She wasn't the bad guy here. That's what she had to remind herself. Across from her, the host, a well-known fire starter in political media, flashed a sympathetic smile. Cassidy, let's talk about what really happened on that flight. You were just doing your job, weren't you? Cassidy nodded, leaning in slightly. Exactly. I was following company protocol. I was ensuring that all passengers were in their assigned seats, as I've done countless times before. The host clicked his tongue, shaking his head. And yet, now you're being punished for it. Cassidy exhaled, allowing just the right amount of emotion to slip into her voice. I lost my job over this. I've been harassed online, called a racist, had my entire career ruined over a misunderstanding. The host turned to the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when the woke mob comes after you. A dedicated flight attendant, a woman who spent years in customer service, now thrown under the bus because one influencer decided to play the victim. The audience clapped, some even cheering. And just like that, Cassidy had flipped the narrative. It wasn't about what she had done. It was about what had been done to her. Nia stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The clip was everywhere. Cassidy playing the victim, the headlines shifting, the comment sections turning ugly. Some of the messages in her inbox were just cruel. Others were terrifying. You're ruining people's lives for attention. You're what's wrong with this country. I hope you regret this. One message made her hands go cold. We know where you live. She locked her phone, her pulse racing. Was this worth it? She hadn't asked for this level of hate. She had spoken up because it was the right thing to do. But now, sitting in her mother's living room with the weight of a nation pressing down on her, she wasn't sure anymore. Diane sat beside her, watching carefully. You don't have to keep putting yourself through this, she said gently. Robert L. Carter, standing near the window, shook his head. This is how change happens, he said. First they ignore you. Then they fight you. And right now, Nia, they're fighting you. She pressed her fingers against her temples. I didn't think it would get this far. Robert's voice softened. No one ever does. She thought of all the people who had shared their own experiences with her, the strangers who had thanked her for speaking out, the ones who had been silenced before they could. This wasn't just about her anymore. She exhaled, lifting her phone again, and made a call. To the producers of a national news network. I want to debate her, she said. The response was immediate. This will be watched by millions, Nia. Are you sure? She glanced at Robert, at her mother, at everything this had become. I'm sure. And just like that, the fight wasn't over. The bright studio lights burned hot against Nia's skin as she adjusted the microphone clip to her blazer. Across from her, Cassidy Brenner sat stiffly in her chair, her expression composed but her fingers clenched together on the table. The cameras framed them in perfect symmetry, two women on opposite sides of a national debate. The host, a seasoned journalist with a calm but commanding presence, leaned forward, looking between them. The show had just gone live and millions were watching. Good evening, America, the host began. Tonight we bring you an exclusive conversation between Nia Holloway, the woman whose viral post sparked a nationwide discussion, and Cassidy Brenner, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy. A slight pause, just enough to let the tension settle in the air. Cassidy, the host continued, turning toward her, many have argued that your actions on that flight are an example of a systemic racial bias in the airline industry. How do you respond to that? Cassidy took a breath, her jaw tightening for just a fraction of a second before she spoke. I want to make something clear. I am not a racist. I was following standard procedure. If I checked Ms. Holloway's ticket more than once, it wasn't because of her race. It was because I needed to ensure that every passenger was in the correct seat. Nia didn't flinch. She had expected this response. She folded her hands neatly in front of her and looked Cassidy directly in the eye. Cassidy, she said, her voice steady, if I were a white woman, wearing the same clothes, holding the same first-class ticket, would you have treated me the same way? The air in the studio grew heavy. Cassidy hesitated. It was only for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in her otherwise composed demeanor, but it was enough. Nia held her gaze, unwavering. The host let the silence stretch before stepping in. Cassidy, would you like to answer? Cassidy's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I... She blinked, glancing down, just for a second, as if trying to find the right words. The audience at home wouldn't miss it. Neither would the viewers replaying this moment in the days to come. I don't believe I did anything wrong, Cassidy finally said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I treated Ms. Holloway with the same level of professionalism I extend to every passenger. The host didn't push further. Instead, they turned to Nia. Nia, what do you say to that? Nia exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. I say that this isn't about just one flight or one interaction. It's about a pattern that so many people experience, over and over again. And the worst part? She let her eyes scan the cameras as if speaking directly to every viewer watching. Most of us don't even bother saying anything anymore, because we're used to it. Cassidy's lips pressed together, but she didn't interrupt. The host glanced at their notes before tapping the papers against the table. We actually have something to show both of you. The large screen behind them flickered to life. The surveillance footage from the airplane played once again, the same video that had already gone viral. The audience watching at home saw everything in crystal clear clarity. Cassidy standing in front of Nia, the unnecessary scrutiny, the repeated ticket scans, the way she moved quickly for other passengers but hesitated when it came to Nia. It was irrefutable. Cassidy's face lost color. For the first time, she looked shaken. The host turned back to her. Cassidy, do you still stand by your statement? A pause. A long one. Then Cassidy's breathing grew uneven, her posture stiffening. I don't have to sit here and be attacked like this, she snapped, yanking off her microphone. I came here to share my side, not to be ambushed. With that, she stood up, pushing her chair back so hard it scraped against the polished floor. The camera operators scrambled, unsure whether to follow her as she stormed off the set. The host turned back to Nia, who remained seated, composed. Well, the host said, eyebrows raised. That was, unexpected. Nia let out a breath, unclasping her hands. Maybe not. The broadcast ended minutes later, but the real storm was only beginning. Online, the moment went viral instantly. Cassidy's abrupt departure became the defining image of the night. The public opinion that had wavered before was now firm. Nia had won the debate. But was that enough to change the system? That question still remained. A week had passed since the debate, but the firestorm hadn't died down. If anything, it had only intensified. News segments dissected the exchange between Nia and Cassidy, replaying the moment Cassidy had walked off set. Social media continued to explode with debates, some people praising Nia for standing her ground, others twisting the narrative to paint her as divisive. But the real pressure wasn't just on her anymore. The airline was reeling. They had tried to stay quiet, hoping the outrage would fizzle out. But it hadn't. Passengers were canceling flights, public trust was plummeting, and stockholders were demanding answers. Then finally the company broke its silence. A statement was released across their official channels. We recognize that our policies and training must evolve to ensure all customers are treated with dignity and respect. Effective immediately, we will launch a comprehensive review of our internal procedures, including bias training for all employees. We sincerely apologize to Ms. Holloway and to anyone who has ever felt discriminated against while traveling with us. The public's reaction was mixed. Some saw it as a necessary step. Others dismissed it as another empty corporate apology. Nia wasn't impressed. She knew a PR move when she saw one. Her skepticism deepened when she received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID flashed a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. Ms. Holloway, a deep professional voice greeted her. This is Richard Lawson, CEO of, he named the airline. I'd like to speak with you about how we can move forward. Nia leaned back on her couch, gripping the phone a little tighter. Move forward how? We'd like to discuss ways to improve our internal policies, Lawson continued. We believe your perspective could be invaluable in helping us shape meaningful change. Perhaps we can collaborate to implement better training and procedures. There it was. The same company that had dismissed her experience as a misunderstanding now wanted her help. She exhaled. You're asking me to help fix a system that failed me? There was a brief silence. We're asking for your partnership in ensuring it doesn't happen again. Nia closed her eyes thinking. If she walked away now, she wouldn't be blamed. She had already done more than enough. But if she accepted, if she worked with them, would it be real change or just another corporate stunt? She needed time. "I'll think about it," she finally said. Lawson's tone remained neutral. "That's all we ask." That night, she met with Robert L. Carter and a group of civil rights advocates in a small community center in Atlanta. The room was quiet except for the sound of pens scratching against notebooks, the occasional sip of coffee. Robert leaned forward, hands clasped. "They're offering you a seat at the table." Nia nodded. "But is that seat just for show?" One of the activists, a woman in her 50s named Angela, spoke up. "Corporations make promises like this all the time. They want to pacify people, keep the bad press from getting worse. But if you do take this deal, you have leverage." Robert added, "The real question is, what are your terms?" Nia tapped her fingers against the table, thinking, bias training isn't enough. It's performative unless there's real structural change. "So what do you want?" Robert pressed. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I want more than a training program. I want a commitment to hiring more people of color in leadership positions. I want their hiring and promotion policies reviewed. I want transparency in how they handle discrimination complaints. And I want an independent oversight group to hold them accountable." Angela smiled. "Now that's a real demand." Robert nodded approvingly. "If they agree to those terms, you'll know they're serious." "And if they don't?" Nia asked. Robert's expression hardened. "Then we keep fighting." The next morning she made the call. "I'll work with you," she told Lawson, "but on my terms." She listed her conditions, laying them out clearly, firmly. There was silence on the other end. Then Lawson spoke. "This is a lot to consider." Nia didn't blink. "Take all the time you need. But if you're not willing to commit to real change, I won't be part of this." When the call ended, she exhaled. Now all she could do was wait. Was the company truly ready to change? Or was this just another way to silence her? She didn't have the answer yet, but she was prepared for either outcome. 2 weeks had passed since the televised debate, but the effects of that night still lingered. The world had watched, and now the airline had no choice but to respond. Their statement was released in the early hours of the morning, posted across their website and social media. Unlike their first attempt at damage control, this one was different. It wasn't just an empty promise, it was a commitment to change. Nia sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the announcement, reading every word carefully. "Effective immediately, we are implementing mandatory unconscious bias training for all employees, including flight attendants, ground staff, and corporate leadership. Additionally, we are committing to increasing diversity in our hiring and promotion practices, with a goal to elevate more Black and minority employees into leadership positions. We recognize that past practices have contributed to unequal treatment, and we sincerely apologize to Ms. Holloway and to any customer who has ever felt unwelcome while flying with us." The words hung in the air. Nia felt like something had shifted. She wasn't naive. She knew corporations often made promises they didn't keep. But this was more than she had expected. They weren't just apologizing, they were taking action. Her phone buzzed, a new email. It was from the airline's CEO, a direct, personal message. "Ms. Holloway, I want to extend my deepest apologies, not just for what you experienced, but for the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. We failed you, and for that, I take responsibility. I hope we can work together to ensure real change. I appreciate your voice, and I acknowledge that we should have listened sooner." Nia let out a slow breath, setting the phone down. Was this victory? While Nia's name trended in the news as the woman who forced change, Cassidy Brenner had become something else entirely, a cautionary tale. Her termination from the airline was swift and final. She had tried to fight it, arguing that she had only been following company procedures, that she was being unfairly targeted. But the airline, desperate to save face, cut ties without hesitation. Now Cassidy was struggling to find a new job. She had applied to multiple airlines, only to receive the same response. "We appreciate your interest, but at this time, we are moving forward with other candidates." She sat at her kitchen counter, staring at her laptop screen, an open job application staring back at her. She had been in the industry for years, had worked tirelessly to climb the ranks. And now she was untouchable. She had agreed to one last interview with a small, conservative media outlet. It was her chance to control the damage, to tell her side of the story. But as she sat in front of the camera, microphone clipped to her sweater, she struggled to find the right words. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I didn't think it would turn into something this big." The interviewer leaned forward. "Do you think you were treated unfairly?" Cassidy hesitated. I, I was just following protocol," she said, echoing the same words she had been telling herself for weeks. But even as she said them, they felt hollow, because the truth was she had hesitated when she saw Nia. She had doubted her, and now the world had seen it too. For Nia, the emails and messages continued. Some congratulated her. Others still sent hate. But the biggest question came from within herself. What now? She had set out to visit her family, to take a short break from work. Now she had unintentionally become the face of something much bigger than herself. She had achieved what she wanted, real policy change. But was that enough? Could she really just go back to writing travel blogs and restaurant reviews? Robert L. Carter met her for coffee that afternoon, sensing the weight in her voice when she had called him. "You did it," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "They listen." Nia nodded slowly. "Yeah, but—" She hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know if it'll last. What if they only made these changes because they had no choice? What if, a year from now, nothing really changes?" Robert studied her for a moment. "Change is slow," he admitted, "and messy, but you forced the first step. That's more than most people ever get to do." She looked down at her hands. "Do I keep going?" "That's up to you," he said simply. "The fight's not over, but no one will blame you if you decide to step back. You didn't ask for this." No, she hadn't. But now she had a choice. She could walk away, let the system run its course. Or she could keep pushing, knowing it would take time, knowing it would be exhausting, but also knowing she had the power to make a difference. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, staring at the steam curling into the air. The decision wasn't easy, but she already knew her answer. The auditorium was packed. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and quiet curiosity. The room hummed with the kind of energy that only came when people knew they were about to hear something important. Nia stood at the podium, her fingers resting lightly on the microphone. The bright overhead lights cast a warm glow on her face. But it wasn't the glare of the cameras or the size of the audience that made her pause. It was the weight of this moment. 1 month ago, she had been just another traveler trying to make it home. Now she was here, standing in front of an audience at a national conference on equity in the service industry, speaking as someone who had not just witnessed injustice, but had forced the system to acknowledge it. She took a steadying breath. "When I first wrote about what happened to me," she began, her voice even but strong, "I didn't think it would lead me here. I was just frustrated, tired, tired of feeling like I didn't belong in spaces where I had every right to be." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. She let her gaze sweep across the room. "And I know I'm not the only one. That's why we're here today, right?" A few nods. Some leaned forward, listening more intently. The thing about discrimination is that it's not always obvious. It doesn't always look like someone saying, "You don't belong here." Sometimes it's a hesitation, a second glance, a quiet assumption that you must have made a mistake because people like you aren't supposed to be in first class, in boardrooms, in positions of power. The room was silent now, hanging on every word. "And that's the problem," she continued. "It's not just about one airline, one flight attendant, or one incident. It's about the systems we work within, the policies, the training, or lack of it, the biases that go unchecked until someone says, 'This isn't okay.'" She paused, letting the message settle. "And when we do speak up," she met the eyes of as many people as she could, "we're called difficult, dramatic, overreacting. But the truth is, change doesn't happen unless someone makes it uncomfortable first." A few people clapped. Others murmured in agreement. Nia let a small smile touch her lips. "Speaking up is hard," she admitted. "And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. that I didn't wonder if I was making too much of a situation I could have just let go. But then I thought, if I don't say something, who will? The applause grew louder. She took another breath. We can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge, and we can't expect change if we aren't willing to demand it. The industry is paying attention now, but this moment only matters if we keep pushing, if we don't let them forget. The room erupted into applause. As she stepped back from the podium, she spotted Robert L. Carter in the front row. He gave her a knowing nod, his arms crossed in satisfaction. She had done it. She had turned frustration into something bigger than herself. After the conference, as the attendees milled about, Nia found herself approached by a young woman, barely in her 20s. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Ms. Holloway?" Nia turned, offering a warm smile. "Just Nia." The woman smiled nervously. "I just wanted to say thank you. I saw your interview and I've had experiences like that, but I never thought anyone would care, or that speaking up would even make a difference." Nia's chest tightened. The young woman exhaled. "I never thought someone like me could belong in these spaces, but now I know I do." For a second, Nia could only nod, because that was it, wasn't it? That was why this mattered. She squeezed the woman's hand lightly before she left, then turned toward the window of the conference center. Outside in the distance, a plane lifted into the sky, its silver body gleaming against the setting sun. She had spent so much time fighting this battle, she hadn't stopped to think about what came next. Did she go back to her old life, writing about places and food and adventure? Or was this just the beginning of something new? The roar of the airplane engines faded as the aircraft disappeared into the horizon. Maybe she didn't have to choose. Maybe this was just another departure, one that would take her somewhere she had never expected to go. In the end, this wasn't just about one flight, one airline, or even one person. It was about something much bigger: the quiet assumptions, the unspoken barriers, and the moments of doubt that too many people face every day. But Nia's story proves that speaking up does matter. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't come easy. But when one voice rises, it can inspire others to do the same. So what do you think? Can real change happen, or will companies just keep making empty promises? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for the next one.